The story you will hear today began on an ordinary day in Pineville Municipal Court. Thomas Gregory, an experienced and dedicated federal prosecutor, went there to solve a simple case, challenging a tax error on a house that had been in his family for decades. However, what seemed like just another work routine turned into something much bigger, a revelation about how subtle biases can shape a system that should be fair to everyone. While waiting his turn, Thomas began to notice something deeply disturbing. Late people were being treated in completely different ways depending on who they were. Some received heavy fines, while others got away with simple warnings. He saw nervous faces, shaking hands holding documents, and realized that many there were not just fighting the law, but something much deeper, a system that seemed to work against them. When it was finally Thomas's turn, the unexpected happened. Instead of having his case heard fairly, he was publicly reprimanded and fined. Meanwhile, other people who had made similar or even more serious mistakes left without any consequences. Thomas knew something was wrong. He could feel it in the heavy atmosphere of the room and the uncomfortable gazes of the people witnessing the scene. It was at that moment that he made a firm decision. I will not let this go. What you'll discover today isn't just Thomas's fight against a judge. It's a story about how one person, by seeing the truth in the midst of an unjust system, can find the courage to initiate a change that no one believed possible. This story will show you that, as difficult as it may seem, raising your voice against what is wrong can inspire transformation that goes beyond cities, states, and even countries. If you've ever felt like justice wasn't for everyone, or believe something needs to change, stay with me. This story is for you. Just imagine, the clock read exactly 8:42 a.m. when Thomas Gregory parked his car in front of the municipal court in Pineville, Louisiana. The sun was shining brightly, and the shadows stretched across the asphalt as if to warn that time doesn't stop. Thomas took a deep breath before getting out of the car. He hated being late. As a federal prosecutor, his life was marked by discipline and preparation. But that day, it seemed like the universe had other plans. The morning started simply, without any major complications. Thomas needed to dispute a tax error on his grandmother's house. This house was not just a set of bricks and a roof. For him, it was the place where he grew up and learned what was right and wrong under the firm but loving eye of his grandmother. But the city suddenly decided to raise taxes, and he spent weeks gathering evidence to show that it was a mistake. Dressed in a dark blue suit and a crisp white shirt, Thomas looked prepared for any battle. However, before leaving home, he received an urgent call about a case of human trafficking. He reviewed documents, gave instructions to his team, and rushed to the courthouse, already feeling the weight of being late. As he climbed the steps of the building, his cell phone vibrated. A message from the assistant flashed on the screen. The judge here has a reputation for being strict with delays. Be careful. Thomas sighed, put his cell phone in his briefcase and continued. He knew he had everything he needed, evidence and arguments. Even so, the warning echoed in his mind. Municipal court was very different from the federal courts where he used to work. The beige walls, the worn benches, the smell of old coffee and paper filled the room. Despite being simple, the place was buzzing with people holding documents with anxious expressions. The clock now read 8:50. Thomas had 10 minutes to find the right room. He followed the signs down the halls until he stopped in front of a door with a sign that said, Room 204, Judge Robert Lawrence Brooks. He adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and entered. The room was almost full. Thomas found a seat in the back, sat down, and opened his folder to review his notes. A few minutes later, the judge entered. He was a tall man, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface. As soon as he walked through the door, the room fell silent. All stand, the officer announced. Thomas stood up with everyone. The judge began calling cases with impressive efficiency, direct and blunt. Thomas noticed a man coming in late and soon after, a young woman. None of them received even a glance from the judge. He knew his turn would come. At 9:15, Thomas's name was called. He picked up his briefcase and walked to the podium, trying to appear calm. He presented himself professionally, but the judge's gaze hardened as soon as he saw him. The silence in the room became thick. "You're late, Mr. Gregory." The judge's voice sounded like thunder, cutting through the silence of the room with cruel precision. "Do you think this court's time is worth less than yours?" Thomas shivered, but didn't allow himself to give in. He raised his hands, an apologetic gesture, trying to hold on to what was left of his composure. "Your Honor, I apologize. I was called to a federal emergency before I got here," he said, his voice strained but still respectful, trying to hold himself together under the weight of disapproval. Judge Brooks showed no sign of leniency. His eyes were icy, unforgiving. "Apologies do not erase the fact that you broke what should be the simplest of duties, punctuality. This court demands order and respect. If you can't offer even that, I suggest you rethink your priorities." The tension in the room rose, the air charged with the energy of an imminent confrontation. Thomas felt the judge's every word like a knife, but he remained unshakable. He knew that his true strength lay in the evidence and arguments he brought, not in empty words. With a sigh, he chose his words with surgical precision. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of being punctual, but if I may, I would like to present my case on the house tax." The judge, with a merciless gesture, raised his hand, interrupting him with the authority of a man who would not tolerate another word. "Let's get to that. But first, your failure to respect. This compromises the integrity of this court. You are fined $50. The words fell like a death sentence, reverberating off the walls of the room. Thomas felt his jaw tighten involuntarily, the weight of humiliation, but he didn't let his expression betray what he felt inside. He was experienced enough to maintain control. All around, the growing murmur indicated that the audience felt the impact of every word. Taking a deep breath, he tried again. "Your Honor, I can explain," but the judge gave no room. With a merciless blow of the hammer, he declared, "Consider this a lesson in respect, Mr. Gregory. The lesson that in this court, order and respect come before any justification." Thomas returned to his seat, but now his mind was racing. This wasn't just about a delay. There was something more. He looked around and saw the other people who had also arrived late. A young woman, distracted on her cell phone, had not even been noticed by the judge. One man, presenting his case without interruption, appeared to have faced no reprimand. The difference in treatment was evident. Thomas knew he couldn't ignore what was happening. His mind racing, he opened the folder, not to review the tax documents, but to write down everything he saw. His pen ran quickly across the paper as he recorded every detail. The court moved at its pace, but Thomas couldn't take his eyes off the injustice he had just witnessed. That $50 fine didn't feel like a lesson, but rather an arbitrary punishment. Finally, his name was called again. He stood up slowly, walking steadily to the podium. The judge gave him a hard look, as if daring him to show any sign of weakness. But Thomas was ready. "Your Honor, I have all the documentation here that proves the property tax error. This house has been in my family for generations. The 30% tax increase is inconsistent with previous tax assessments and was imposed without any formal notification," Thomas said, his voice firm but tense. He opened his briefcase with precision, displaying organized documents, as if each sheet was a defense against the weight of the accusation he felt. He pointed to a specific page, as if it were the key to his redemption. "Here are the original tax assessments, consistent for 5 years. The recent increase is completely unjustified." Judge Brooks, however, leaned back in his chair with a wry smile. His eyes were filled with disdain, and the coldness in his expression was palpable. "I will review this in due time, Mr. Gregory. However, its delay is not something we can simply ignore. Do you really believe that your federal responsibilities justify breaking the rules of this court?" The room seemed to freeze the moment the judge spoke. Thomas felt the pressure, but he didn't give in. He remained calm, every word calculated, every breath controlled. "Your Honor, I did not intend to disrespect this court. The delay occurred because I was handling an urgent federal case involving human trafficking. I believe everyone here understands the seriousness of the situation and the need for immediate action." The judge's eyes narrowed, but he maintained a rigid tone, as if his words were an irrevocable sentence. "Your priorities, no matter how noble, do not justify breaking the rules. Rules exist for a reason." It was as if he was saying that nothing Thomas said mattered, as if, no matter how hard he tried, he would never be able to break through the wall of indifference erected in front of him. Thomas felt a surge of frustration, but he forced himself not to give in. "I knew that what was at stake was much bigger than what was happening there." He took a deep breath, holding back the anger that threatened to emerge, but maintained his posture. The court seemed suspended in time as Judge Brooks, with the authority of a man who believed his word was the only one that mattered, declared, "The rules apply equally to everyone here." The silence in the room was deafening. Discomfort was written on the faces of everyone present, but no one dared to say a word. Thomas knew those words weren't true, at least not for him. He took a deep breath, as if it was his last breath before fighting for the last chance. "Your Honor, I'm just asking for clarity. Justice needs to be the same for everyone, not just me," he said, the calm in his voice contrasting with the internal storm he was trying to control. The judge didn't like what he heard at all. With a violent blow of the hammer, he stopped the rising tension. "I will not tolerate accusations against this court. Your $50 fine is upheld." Thomas tilted his head slightly, his expression impassive. He knew that, at that moment, he could not win. But he showed no weakness. He just responded with the same serenity he had maintained since the beginning. "Thank you, Your Honor." The room fell silent, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stop. Thomas knew that that battle was far from won, but there was still something greater to be achieved. He returned to his seat, feeling the curious looks around him. Some people seemed amazed, others clearly uncomfortable. Thomas was no stranger to moments like this. I had faced prejudice disguised as authority before, but this time there was something different. The tension in the room was palpable, as if everyone was waiting for him to take action. Discreetly, Thomas took out his cell phone and started taking notes. He had already decided this situation would not end there. As the court continued its routine, Thomas began to notice small details around him. An older black man sitting a few rows away turned and gave him an approving look. A law student was scribbling frantically in her notebook, clearly overwhelmed by what she had just witnessed. The clerk hesitated as she typed, visibly uncomfortable. When the session ended, Thomas did not leave immediately. He remained seated, watching people as they left the room, carrying with him the unspoken weight of what had just happened. Finally, Thomas picked up his briefcase and left the courtroom. The cool breeze outside, however, did not ease the tension he felt. He stopped on the steps, looking at the horizon as he reflected on what had just happened. He picked up the phone and opened the contact information for the assistant federal prosecutor. His thumb hovered over the call button, but he muttered to himself, "Not yet." He knew he had something bigger on his hands. The interactions he witnessed in that room made it clear that this was not an isolated situation, but a pattern, something structural. Back in the car, Thomas opened his briefcase and took out his gold federal prosecutor's badge. The emblem reflected the sunlight, almost like a silent reminder of his responsibility. He took a deep breath, feeling determination rising within him, and made a decision. Thomas returned to court. The room was quieter, with few cases still in progress. Judge Brooks leafed through documents, looking more tired than before. Thomas walked up to the podium with steady steps, holding his badge and identification in plain view. The clerk stopped typing the moment she saw him approaching. The judge looked up, irritation clear in his gaze, as if he had been challenged by Thomas's very presence. "Mr. Gregory, the session has already ended. If you have something to deal with, schedule an appointment." His voice cut the air with authority. Thomas remained impassive, his stance unwavering, but his voice carried a palpable intensity. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I believe I must formally introduce myself," he said, his eyes fixed on the judge. He then held up the badge so that everyone in the room could see it clearly, the light reflecting off the insignia as an unmistakable sign of his rank. I'm Thomas Gregory, Assistant United States Attorney. I've been at the Department of Justice for more than a decade, handling human trafficking, corruption, and civil rights violations. The words reverberated through the room, as if the atmosphere had instantly changed. The judge stood still, his hands still on the papers, his face turning pale as he realized the magnitude of what had just been revealed. Silence took over the room, and the few present watched, fixedly, with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Thomas didn't give the judge time to react. His voice, now firm, continued to resonate in the air. Your Honor, I was late this morning because I was dealing with an urgent federal case that required my immediate attention. I fully understand the importance of rules and procedures, but I need to point out something crucial. There was a clear difference in the treatment of delays here today. The judge frowned, visible discomfort appearing on his face. He didn't like the direction the conversation was going. Mr. Gregory, if you think there was a problem with the process, you have every right to file a formal complaint, he replied, trying to regain control. Thomas, unfazed, lifted the notebook where he had written everything down. His posture was that of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. I've already started documenting, Your Honor, not just because of my case, but because of the differences I observed in the treatment of other latecomers, especially since these differences seem to follow a racial pattern. As a federal prosecutor, it is my duty to report any sign of bias or discrimination. The impact of Thomas's words was immediate. The room was completely silent, as if time had stopped. The clerk, who had been typing frantically until then, hesitated and looked nervously at Thomas and the judge. A young law student sitting in the back was scribbling notes at speed, clearly fascinated by what was happening. The judge, clearly uncomfortable, leaned back in his chair, trying to regain his composure. This court takes these matters very seriously. If you believe there has been an error, I suggest using the appropriate channels to address this, he said, his voice now less confident. Thomas placed the badge on the podium, highlighting his position even more firmly. I plan to do that, Your Honor, but I believe that this moment is also an opportunity for reflection for all of us. We need to ensure that the principles of fairness and equality are upheld in all courts, not just documents. The tension in the room was almost palpable. For the first time, Judge Brooks, known for his unyielding and unbeatable stance, appeared uncertain. He gripped the arms of his chair as if trying to anchor himself, his confidence clearly shaken by Thomas's firmness. You can go, Mr. Gregory, he said, his voice lower, almost without energy, as if the words cost him more than he imagined. Thomas, still with the calmness of someone who knew he had fulfilled his role, collected his credentials and gave a slight wave, a farewell that didn't need to be said in words. Just as he was about to walk out the door, he turned around and, with a tone that carried a promise, said, "Thank you, Your Honor. I will ensure this is handled correctly." The door closed behind him, and the room remained silent, the weight of tension still hanging in the air. As Thomas walked down the courthouse steps, he knew this was just the beginning. He was not just fighting for himself, but for everyone who was silently facing injustice. And this fight was far from over. Headlines began to take over local and national media. Prejudice in Pineville Court. Federal prosecutor confronts judge. The story of Thomas Gregory defying Judge Brooks spread quickly, taking on proportions he had never imagined. Outside the courtroom, Thomas remained focused. He knew the case was bigger than his personal experience. Even though reporters constantly approached him for interviews, he chose to remain reserved, keeping his focus on the investigation. The reports kept coming. The Pineville community, initially hesitant, began to open up. People who had faced similar situations felt encouraged by Thomas's stance. Among the reports, stories of striking injustices. A black woman was severely fined for crossing outside the lane, while a white man, in the same situation, was merely warned. A young black man harshly reprimanded for being late, while another white defendant had his tardiness ignored completely. The Judicial Review Commission has intensified its investigation, with detailed records being analyzed. Mrs. Thompson's notebook and the testimonies of officials such as James Wilson became centerpieces. The pattern of discrimination was not just visible, it was impossible to ignore. The media also played an important role. A national television program invited Thomas for an interview, but he declined. Instead, he issued a press release. "This is not a case about me, but about ensuring that everyone is treated fairly under the law. Our justice system should be a pillar of equality, not a reflection of our prejudices." Meanwhile, public pressure on Judge Brooks was mounting. Civil rights groups organized protests in front of the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Justice for all and no more double standards." The hashtag, #JustEqualJustice, began to gain traction on social media, gathering support from across the country. Thomas, for his part, remained meticulous. He knew the case could not be based on public pressure alone. "I needed solid proof." He spent nights reviewing testimony, collecting evidence and preparing reports for the Judicial Review Commission. In one of the meetings with Katie Couric, she commented, "Thomas, the impact of this is already being felt. It's not just about Judge Brooks. His stance is making other people reflect on how the system operates." "That's what we need, Katie," Thomas replied. "It's not just about one person. It's about changing the system." Days later, the Commission issued a preliminary statement. "The evidence suggests a consistent pattern of discrimination in Judge Brooks' courtroom. Steps are being taken to ensure that justice is restored and that fairness returns to the foundation of our system." Thomas knew there was still a lot to be done, but this was an important step. He looked out his office window, seeing the community united, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The pressure on Judge Brooks increased every day. His public statement, in which he regretted any unintentional actions, sounded hollow and defensive, unable to calm the outrage gripping the community. The public saw those words as a desperate attempt to minimize decades of systematic discrimination. Meanwhile, Thomas Gregory continued tirelessly, gathering evidence and expanding the scope of the investigation. The human stories behind the numbers were devastating. Thomas heard from mothers telling how they had lost their homes to exorbitant and unfair fines, young people bearing the brunt of public humiliation in court, and workers struggling to pay disproportionate penalties for minor infractions. Each report reinforced the certainty that this was not an isolated problem, but part of something much larger, deeply rooted in the system. Outside the court, protests grew. Activists held signs and shouted slogans that echoed through the streets. Social media kept the outrage alive, with thousands of people sharing their own experiences under the hashtag #JustiçaIgualagora. The case had already gone beyond the borders of Pineville, gaining national attention. Television programs, articles and debates called into question the impartiality of the judicial system, while civil rights groups mobilized to offer support to victims of the judge's decisions. Meanwhile, the investigation against Brooks progressed quickly. The Judicial Review Commission, pressured by public attention, worked day and night to analyze court records. The final report, released weeks later, was devastating. It became clear that black defendants were disproportionately fined and penalized, while white defendants received more lenient treatment. Benefits such as installments or fine reductions were almost never granted to minorities, and the judge's behavior in court demonstrated a repeated pattern of prejudice and disrespect. When the report was released, Brooks was relieved of his duties and faced the possibility of criminal charges for civil rights violations. The room where he once commanded with authority was now empty, and his once imposing figure became just a symbol of a flawed system. Thomas, in turn, avoided the attention he was receiving as much as possible. Although reluctant, he knew he had become a symbol of the fight for justice. In a rare public statement, he said firmly, "I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because everyone deserves a system that is fair, regardless of color, class, or origin. Justice cannot be a privilege. It must be a right." While the city was still processing the impact of the case, change was already evident. People who were once afraid to speak now found the courage to share their stories. Organizations mobilized to demand reforms in the system. and new investigations were initiated in neighboring courts. Outside the courthouse, Thomas watched the crowd. I knew that fight was far from over, but I felt that something had changed. Justice, which so often seemed distant and inaccessible, was finally beginning to be heard. And as exhausted as he was, Thomas knew he had started something that no one else could stop. Thomas, even in the center of all the turmoil, remained focused. He continued his work as a federal prosecutor while dealing with the flood of messages arriving from across the country. Some were supportive, others from people sharing similar stories of discrimination in courts. But one letter in particular left a deep impression on him. It was from a retired Alabama lawyer who wrote, "For years I saw the same injustices you are describing, but never had the courage to speak out. Thank you for doing what many of us could not." These words touched Thomas in a special way, reminding him that his fight was not limited to Pineville, but resonated across the country. The movement soon spread to other cities in Louisiana. Courts began to be overhauled, activists and journalists investigated similar cases, and the State Judicial Oversight Committee announced a complete review of municipal courts, promising to end systemic bias. At the end of the month, the Judicial Review Commission completed its preliminary report, and the conclusions were devastating. Judge Brooks' actions were just the tip of the iceberg of a larger, deeply rooted problem. The report called for immediate changes, such as mandatory anti-bias training for judges, regular audits of decisions, and the creation of independent oversight committees. The pressure on Judge Brooks became unsustainable. Facing the possibility of a public hearing and disciplinary action, he announced his resignation, saying in a brief statement, "I believe it is in the best interests of this court and this community for me to step aside." For Thomas, Brooks's resignation was not cause for celebration. He knew this was just the beginning. The real work was just beginning. With renovations underway, Thomas has been invited to share his experience at law schools, community forums, and conferences. He became an inspiration to young lawyers, especially those from underrepresented groups, who now believed they could make a difference. At one such event, a black law student approached Thomas after the speech and said, "You showed me that the law is not just about rules, but about people. You gave me a reason to fight for justice." Thomas smiled humbly and replied, "The fight is just beginning, but if each of us does our part, we can improve the system." Months after it all started, the Pineville courthouse already looked different. The worn walls had been repainted, and a new welcome desk welcomed visitors. Signs in multiple languages indicated available resources, such as payment plans and legal assistance. A small sign at the entrance reminded everyone who passed by that justice and equality are not just words, but commitments. Outside, a new sign was placed near the entrance reading, "Equal justice is everyone's right." Inside, the changes were even more visible. Judge Brooks was no longer there. He had quietly left after resigning, and in charge was now a younger judge known for his fairness and impartiality. But the most important thing was not just the change of judges. New rules were changing the entire system. All court staff were now required to undergo special anti-bias training, where experts explained how small actions could unintentionally bring unfairness to decisions. In the back of the courtroom, Thomas sat, watching everything. He had been invited to speak about the changes being made. As he waited his turn, he felt a mixture of pride and hope, knowing that his fight had not only created meaningful change in Pineville, but was also beginning to open doors for a more just system across the country. Things were looking up, but Thomas knew there was still a lot of work to do. The impact of his fight was not restricted to Pineville. What he started inspired other cities in Louisiana and even other states. Judicial councils began reviewing their systems, paying special attention to racial and social disparities in case outcomes. Groups were formed to monitor the courts, made up of lawyers, community advocates, and even people who had already been through trials. In Thomas Gregory's office, the ticket he received that fateful morning hung on the wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of why he decided to fight. Below the ticket was a photo of a recent event, a group of young law students who had created a civil rights clinic in his honor. They were smiling, full of hope, and Thomas felt a responsibility to inspire that generation even more. In the community, the effects of Thomas's struggle were visible. James Wilson, the court clerk who worked with Judge Brooks, now led anti-bias training for new employees. During one session, he said, "Our job is not just to maintain order, it's to make sure everyone who comes in here is treated with dignity. If you see something wrong, speak up. Being silent is the same as agreeing." Senora Thompson, who had already witnessed so many injustices in court, was promoted and now supervised a program dedicated to ethical practices in the judiciary, ensuring that past mistakes never repeated again. Thomas also began teaching at a law school, teaching about ethics and civil rights in the judicial system. His students were inspired by their history and always asked questions. In one of these classes, a student, holding a notebook full of ideas, asked, "Teacher, what can we do to make the system fairer?" Thomas thought for a moment and replied, "Listen. Listen to the people who pass through the courts. Listen to those who are afraid to speak. The real change begins when we hear." Of course, not everyone was happy with the changes. Some lawyers and judges complained that the new rules limited their authority, but the results spoke for themselves. In 1 year, racial differences in fines and sentences had decreased dramatically. At the Pineville court, people began to report that they felt more respected, and payment plans requests were approved more often. For Thomas, the most exciting moments were when people came to him to thank. One day, an older black man who was in court the morning he started came back just to talk to him. "I've been here for 40 years, said the man, thrilled. "I've seen so much injustice, but I never thought I would live to see someone say it is enough. Thanks for giving us hope." These words remembered Thomas that his fight was not just for one case, but for justice to everyone. He was in the office when he received a letter from a young public defender from Chicago. This lawyer had read about the story of Thomas and, inspired by his courage, decided to start an investigation into prejudice in local courts. The letter ended with a deep phrase. "Your position reminded me because I became a lawyer in the first place." Thomas read the letter twice, feeling the weight of the words, and then carefully put it in a folder entitled Impact. He leaned back in his chair, letting the moment settle. I knew it wasn't about him. It had never been. It was about the countless people whose voices had been ignored for so long. Now, finally, these voices were being heard. Months later, Thomas returned to court where it all started, but this time it was not for a case or an investigation. He had been invited to a very special event, the inauguration of a new court of judicial ethics, created in part thanks to his efforts. When he climbed the podium, he looked at the crowd in front of him. Judges, lawyers, court officials, and community members filled the room, their faces a mixture of expectation and gratitude. Thomas began to speak, his calm but full of emotion. "Justice is not just about laws. It is about how we treat people who enter our courts. It is about justice, dignity, and respect, and above all, it is about ensuring that each person, no matter who it is, know that his voice matters." The room exploded in applause, but Thomas did not focus on the sound. He looked at the faces in the audience. He saw hope. He saw determination. He saw the beginning of something real. And at that moment, I knew that although the work was still far from over, that was a big step in the right direction. Thomas's struggle began as one to correct a personal injustice, but what he revealed was a much larger problem, rooted in decades of inequality. His courage not only exposed prejudice within that court in Pineville, but also inspired reforms that echoed far beyond its walls. Today, the transformation is visible. People who were once silenced now have room to speak. Courts are being re-evaluated, and concrete measures are being taken to ensure that justice is truly the same for everyone. Thomas didn't do it alone, but he was the catalyst who showed that a voice may be enough to start a change. And this story doesn't end here. She is a powerful reminder that when we face something wrong, we can't shut up. Change begins when we have the courage to say, "This is not fair." And when many voices come together, transformation is possible. Now, it is up to us all. The system only improves when each person, each community chooses to do their part. If Thomas managed to start this revolution, imagine what we can do together. Because justice is not just an ideal, it is everyone's right, and the fight for it should never stop. If you like this story, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Here you will find exciting stories every day made to touch the heart, and I'm sure the story that is appearing on the screen now will thrill you too. Don't miss it.